Hi, this is Tim Jones, and I'm joined by my good friend Hamad Hassan. We live 12 time zones apart. One of us lives in America. I'll let you guess which one that is. And today, Hamad is going to ask me some questions about a couple very important wars that the United States has been involved in, specifically our very first war as a nation, and that is the Revolutionary War. And then about 80 years later, the American Civil War. So I'm going to let Hamad play host. And Hamad, go ahead and ask me any questions you'd like.
Thank you, Tim. So our viewers know that United States of America is a big country in this world and have too much influence in the politics of the world. But today we will talk about that what in the history through which phase Americans and the United States of America have gone through that today they are so powerful and so developed country. So we will be talking about some revolutionary wars which America fought back in the history, and they fought with the Britishers. Hi Tim, are you ready
I am
to
ready.
answer my questions?
Yes,
Okay.
I'll do my best.
So Tim, do you feel that what was the main reason why this war was started, and who started that war?
Okay. There's different names for the Revolutionary War. Some call it the War for Independence, but most Americans know it as the Revolutionary War. It was absolutely started by the American colonists. There were in 1775 is when the war started. It ended in 1781, and it was started because British citizens who lived in what was then the American colonies on the eastern edge of what is now the United States, they were angry with King George because they viewed themselves as being taxed by Great Britain, but not having the right to make decisions for themselves. There was a big protest called "No Taxation Without Representation," and so this really became about the feeling among colonists that they were being unfairly treated and not given the rights to make up their own decisions. And Great Britain was just using the colonies to get resources from them and giving very little in return. I should also add that initially, many of the people in the colonies of the Americas were not in favor of this war. This was a very controversial war. Almost half of the colonies wanted to stay loyal to Great Britain and did not want this war. But ultimately, in the end, the pro-war people decided we need to break away from Great Britain and start the war. And the most famous American document ever written was the Declaration of Independence, which was written and signed on July 4, 1776. And ever since that day, we celebrate the 4th of July, also known as Independence Day, the day we officially declared we are breaking away from Great Britain and we are our own country, and our country will be known as the United States of America.
Do you believe that it was the tax system of the imperial British rule, which you think that it was taking all the resources from the America and was shifting to the British?
Yes, that was a major, major reason. There were other factors. Over time, Great Britain and King George started doing some actions, arresting a whole bunch of people just for expressing dissatisfaction with the king. He started having British soldiers just arresting people, and people started getting angrier and angrier by the way they felt King George was treating the colonists. That's what the Americans were called before they became a separate country. They were referred to as the colonies, and the people were the colonists. So, but at its core, it was that they felt, as you said, Hamad, that Great Britain was taking our money, taking our resources, and we were not getting nearly enough in return.
As you know that this war is somehow different than the Afghanistan war or Iraq war. Do you feel this war was justified, and was it a moral war fought for the virtuous reasons?
Yes, I hear what you're saying. I'm sure if we could go back in time to 1781, there would still be some colonists who would say we should never have fought this war. But in the hindsight of history, looking back 200 and some odd years, 250 years roughly, absolutely, most Americans will feel this was a righteous, moral war. we wanted to establish something that had not existed in the world ever before, and that was a democracy where, in theory, I got to put quotations, all men were created equal. That, of course, is in the Declaration of Independence. That the goal of creating a country of the people, for the people, and by the people. But the reality is, in the early stages of our country, it wasn't all the people. It was just men, and just white men, and just white men who were landowners. So the we the people was very narrow initially, and over centuries it expanded to include blacks and to include women and all minorities. But yes, I think almost to a person, Americans would agree in hindsight, it was a very moral war that had to happen. Yes.
So, if we talk about the resources available at that time to the American soldiers, do you think that how well supplied were the American soldiers compared to the British soldiers
Oh,
at that time?
yes. Um, quite frankly, it is sort of amazing that the what we call the Continental Army. That's what the colonists' army, the Americans' army was called the Continental Army. It is amazing that they won the war. They were there were far more British troops. They were far more better equipped, far better fed, and everything. There are some historians that feel that in the end, the reason that Great Britain surrendered and gave in was not because of American military superiority, but because King George got bored and said, you know what? This is too much of a headache. This is too much of a nuisance. I can't be bothered. Let them go. So there are some historians that feel that the reason this Revolutionary War finally ended is Great Britain just got tired of fighting and felt they had other things to deal with. They couldn't be bothered by losing more troops and more lives and spending more money on this annoying colonies over there. Let them go free. Not all historians feel that, but that is the view of some.
That is very funny part of the war. So very interesting to me that the British just left because they were just tired, and they were just tired of the war and of the dead bodies.
Yep.
As you know that war, regardless of the fact that who wins, it results in a large number of people who lost their lives. How many people died in the Revolutionary War?
I thought you might ask this question, so I had to actually look it up. I'm no historian. Approximately about just under 7,000 Americans were killed in the Revolutionary War in combat, and another 6,000 were wounded, and upwards of, get this, 20,000 were taken prisoners. Now, compare those numbers with the British. Historians believe that an additional 17,000 deaths were the result of disease. So more people died of disease in the Revolutionary War than were killed by a bullet or a bayonet. And that includes about 8 to 12,000 who died while they were prisoners of war. It's estimated that approximately 25,000 British soldiers died in the war. So this number includes battlefield deaths, deaths from injuries, and disease. So the biggest cause of loss of life was disease and illness. And the British lost far more people, far more soldiers than the Americans. But they could have kept sending more and more and more. But they finally said enough is enough.
That was too much. And there was another player at that time, France. What role did the nation of France play in that war, and how important was their contribution in the war effort?
That's an excellent question, Hamad. Excellent question. A lot of Americans don't realize that if France did not come to our aid to fight against the British, there's a good chance we'd still be a British colony, or at least we would not have become independent at that time. France and Great Britain were no friends of each other at all. They competed for dominance in Europe, and they were very much antagonists against each other. So when the United States was really, really struggling early on in the war, we had some key people in our country, including somebody named Benjamin Franklin, a famous American citizen who was involved in the Declaration of Independence. He became sort of an ambassador to France, and he took a long time, but he eventually convinced the French king to come to our aid. And so they sent thousands of soldiers and sailors from France to help in our war effort. And ultimately, that made the difference in defeating Great Britain. Without France, most historians would tell you that the Americans would have lost the war.
How did, at the end, the American army ultimately defeat the British army and navy? What was the main reason behind that?
Well, some of it is kind of what we talked about, and that is that we we were fighting for an idea, independence, freedom, for a cause. Great Britain was fighting to put down this rebellion, and I think we just had far more motivation to persist in this war than Great Britain did. It's absolutely true that Great Britain made some military tactical errors in the war, but really, when it comes down to it, it got to the point where they were losing just too many lives. And the United States was led by a general named George Washington, who turned out to be a brilliant military hero. One of the things he's famous for in American history is on Christmas Eve night into Christmas morning, he was in an area called Valley Forge, which is an encampment outside of Philadelphia. And he had his Continental Army troops row boats over the Delaware River in the middle of the night on Christmas morning to attack the British, who were not expecting anything to happen on Christmas Day. And it turned out to be a very important military victory that started to turn the tide of the war towards the Americans.
If I'm not wrong, the George Washington picture is also printed on the dollar of the American currency. And who basically was George Washington, and why he is so important in American history?
Most American historians would say, he was our first president. He was the unanimous choice. He wasn't elected. Most of American presidents were elected, but in 17, I think it is 17, I got to remember, 89, the Continental Congress essentially said, we need you to be our president. They picked him. There was no vote, not by the people. The Congress essentially picked him. And he was very popular because he was a military war hero. He led the Continental Army to victory over Great Britain. So he was a military war hero, but he was also a great statesman. He is considered by many Americans to this day to be one of our 2 or 3 greatest presidents ever. Interestingly, he was 6'4" at a time when the average man was probably about 5'5" or 5'6". So in his day, he stood out as towering among other people. He, by all accounts, he was a person who was absolutely committed to bringing the country together. At the start of our country, it was very fractious and divided. We don't have time to go into it right now, but initially, the colonies were happy to break away from Great Britain, but they weren't so sure they wanted to align as one nation. They kind of felt like, hey, we've broken away from Great Britain. Now we can do our own thing as 13 separate mini countries. And George Washington was one of the people who helped bring them together as one nation. So he's a very important person in American history.
I think so. It was a remarkable work which the George Washington has done, that he united the 13 territories, and know that there is a United States of America which have 50 states. And I think so it was the most remarkable thing which he did at that time.
Yeah.
And after the war began, a group of politicians met and wrote the Declaration of Independence. And why is this considered such an important document in the history?
Yes, that's another great question. The Declaration of Independence was written by a small group of men. George Washington was not one of the writers of it. Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, these people went on to become presidents, and a few others wrote the Declaration of Independence. And it is a document establishing the moral foundation of our country. What are the principles we as a country stand for, and why do we feel the need to separate from Great Britain? Some people confuse the Declaration of Independence with the U.S. Constitution. Two separate documents. The Declaration of Independence was written in 1776. The Constitution was written sometime in the late 1780s. That was the organization of our government. The Constitution just defined that we're going to have a president and a Congress and a Supreme Court, but it was the Declaration of Independence that said, this is what we stand for as a people. We hold these ideals to be self-evident. But here's what's really, really important. As young a country as the United States is, we are a relatively young country. Our country started in 1776, but we are one of the oldest democracies on earth. And many other countries modeled their form of government based on the principles that we set forth in our Declaration of Independence. The country of Poland in Europe, they literally copied our Constitution when they announced sometime in the 1970s that they were going to become a democratic republic. So the Declaration of Independence, while we haven't by any means lived up to its potential, we as a country have fallen short over and over again. But the core principles really make it one of the most amazing documents ever written to represent the goals of a free society.
Yes, one of the things which I have read about that the Americans were first to implement that the legislation should be separate, the judiciary should be separate, and the executive should be a separate area, and they should not interfere in each other's matters. And I think so. This make a very independent country that was the United States in the terms of democracy.
They also did something that was very radical, and that was they decided early on that religion and government should be kept separate. That was a very novel idea then. So that they felt that the founding fathers, that's what they refer to the people who wrote the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, they felt that it's totally fine to have whatever religion you want, but the government should not be influenced by any church, the Christian church or any church. It should be based on the rule of law, not the rules of a theocracy. That was a radical new concept.
So, guys, this was all about the Revolutionary War. Our friend Tim from the United States told us about some positive things about the war, how the Americans go through that time, and what today they have in the form of the democracy. And in the next session, we will come up the other war, which was a civil war, which happened in 1860. And it has also too much influence in the history, in the making of the United States.
I really enjoyed this discussion talking about the American Revolutionary War. In our next session, when we talk about the American Civil War, even to this day, there are Americans who differ on whether that was a good war or not. Most people think it was a very necessary war, but it was also, I will tell you, the bloodiest, most costly war in American history. More American lives were lost in the Civil War than in all the other wars that the United States has ever been involved in combined. So we'll talk about that next time. Well, that's it for this edition of Across the World. And thank you very much, Hamad. Thank you for the excellent questions. I hope you enjoyed today's session.
Thank you, Tim. Thank you.